for the invitation. When I received the email, I took it as an opportunity to spend a bit of time thinking about heterogeneity. So I'm going to, maybe a little like girls have planned to do, kind of a big, broad sort of overview, and then I'll talk about one particular piece of work that we've been doing. And I tried to think about something which would, I think, be sort of most informative or most unusual. And that's the one piece of work I decided to talk about. So the first thing I want to say is, we all sort of agree, at least in principle, that diversity in the robot system, that seems like a good thing to have. And this is a thing that we've longed for, we've hoped for a long time. And so if we go back to sort of the ancient history of multi-robot systems, there are these two early taxonomies. And it's quite interesting to note that both of those taxonomies considered categorizations of the literature, thinking predominantly about how different the robots were, their capabilities, and how much they could communicate, and how much and what communication they didn't have, and how many robots there were, and a bunch of these separate axes. And that was the main way that they thought about categorizing it. A little later after that, there was this latest survey by Marty and his collaborators, where he talks about this distinction between approaches that were emerging in reactivity and deliberation. So my view is that they basically go back to sort of the genesis of these two very early theses. In fact, as far as I know, the first dissertations on multi-robot coordination, and maybe Lynn can correct me if I'm wrong, and you can see that there's just a few, they're a few months apart there. But if you look at the ideas that were sketched out in sort of Parker's work with Alliance and Matarek's work with the node herd, we sort of see it splitting it into two different ways of thinking about multi-robot systems. So on the left, we have this branch which goes towards deliberate or intentional coordination, which I think is sort of well represented by Parker's Alliance. And within that branch, we see work on task allocation and marketplace methods and research, operations research techniques, and my group has done some work in that space. There's also this other branch on the more sort of emergent techniques, which in the beginning I think were held to sort of believed to have as much promise, maybe equal promise, but there's a reason that I've drawn it as a smaller branch. I think if you just look at the volume of papers in the literature, there's more on this idea of thinking about teams of robots. Using the word teams of robots, just thinking about robots that have a representation of what it means to interact, which is distinct from things that just go about their business in the world and in their actions help others. And of course, these go back to two very different notions of what it means to be rational, right? So Descartes on the left and David Hume on the right. So if I were to draw sort of a broad categorization, I tend to use the word swarms for sort of heterogeneous systems and teams for these systems that are potentially homogeneous or heterogeneous. And I look for good examples, and so here's an example, and it turns out actually I think it's some work that Reed did. And here we have a case where one robot has a manipulator, and another robot has a camera system, and they're providing different capabilities to one another in order to do a manipulation task. It's quite distinct from a system where all the robots are more or less the same and they're wandering around, and by just being many eyes in many places, they're cooperating. And I think that somehow, if you go back to this picture, the idea was that if you look at the title of Parker's dissertation, it was heterogeneous multi-robot cooperation. And the idea was that if we were going to go up the left-hand branch of the tree, we'd be able to do heterogeneous systems well. And it turns out that there are just not that many examples of interesting heterogeneous systems. So this is an example of what Mark spoke about when he said there was a splintering, right? Somehow we got into the real world and we ran into reality, and somehow, rather than really producing rich, interesting heterogeneous systems, we ended up with systems that are mainly deliberative teams, and they're mainly homogeneous. So the third sort of dissertation, which I think is really important if we think about heterogeneous systems, is this work by Tucker Belch. And now his advisor is sitting in the back of the room. So I'm going to tell you a story that he told me a few years ago when I was at a workshop in Georgia Tech. Sorry, I was at CMU, and he told me, I sat down and said, I've read your dissertation, I think it's really interesting. And he said, well, let me tell you the background story to the dissertation. Of course, I was a graduate student, and he said, My idea when I came to grad school was that everywhere in nature we see diversity, we see specialization in ant colonies. And my idea, this is what he said to me, was to set up some experiments where we would have a learning robot system, and I would construct a situation in the environment, and the robots would wander around doing their work, and they would gradually learn things. And as they learned, they would learn to specialize, and they would spontaneously go from becoming a homogeneous system into a heterogeneous system. And he'd done a whole lot of work on multi-robot foraging, and he said, that was the plan, and that's not how it turned out. Every time I did that experiment, the robots that learned were no more efficient as a heterogeneous team than they were as an homogeneous group. And later on, he did other experiments. He did work in RoboCup, and he did work in formation control, where he showed that, in fact, in those cases, you get a benefit from heterogeneity. But in the foraging case, he was never able to show a benefit for a heterogeneous system. And he has some speculations at the end of his dissertation, but as a consequence, one of the major things that came out of this was actually his hierarchical entropy measure for thinking about diversity, which I think is still a very useful thing to go. And he has these great pictures. These are straight out of his work here. You can see at the top that you have a homogeneous group of entities, and then there's sort of a heterogeneous group further down, but how do you measure, how do you get some notion of that? And I think that's very, very important work. So my thinking about multi-robot systems is mainly, if I were to try to think about heterogeneous systems, is to think about how we think about them at a task level. So our work has been predominantly in this work of task allocation, where we think basically of a robot that has some perception as input, does some task assessment to figure out how well it thinks it could do with each task. There's an allocation procedure which helps the robots decide who should do which task, and then they do motion planning or some other work to carry on the task. And so there's a step for decomposing and combining tasks, there's a step for figuring out who should do what, it's a step for moving around the environment. Okay. And the nice thing about this framework, although it has some limitations, is that in theory you can work on these algorithms for task allocation, and those will apply to just about any different problem domain you can think of, and you can write papers about algorithms rather than have to deal with the messy details of robots, and it gives you a useful abstraction to do about these interactive problems. The problem is that, of course, you make a whole bunch of assumptions when you adopt a pipeline like this, right? You're adopting a point of view on the world, and the moment you're actually thinking about decomposition, for example, there's a task assessment and a motion planning problem that's thinking about the world in terms of estimation and control, or estimation and planning. Those should really be done together if you really want some appropriate notion of optimality, rather than just saying, I'm going to assign things. But in spite of this, our thinking has been, well, we work on task allocation procedures, and these could work for heterogeneous robot systems. After all, Alliance is an example of one such system, and heterogeneous robot teams was in the title of the dissertation. So then I looked at one of our papers, and this is a picture from one of our papers. And so we have an example here of conflict. And so we've got two robots. One there is the Terminator robot, and the other is, I think, Bicentennial Man. And they have different tasks. So the Terminator wants to assassinate Sarah Connor. The other one wants to do the laundry. And here we're showing that there's a shared resource. And this is legitimately a picture which I took out of our paper. And what you notice here is that these are two very different robots, so they're intended to be. They have different tasks that they're performing. But really, we were modeling this at the most shallow way possible, which is that they're only going to interfere if they try to move through the world together and have to try to go through the same doorway. So I think if we think about heterogeneity sort of from a task planning point of view, then it's really a question of how do we take this whole problem and think about how to decompose it into components. And that's a question of where are we going to decompose this problem? I mean, we're basically doing an analysis procedure here. Take the top-down procedure, a top-down item, and break it into manageable pieces. So where are we going to do this decomposition, and what are we going to decompose, and how are we going to do that? And there are some nice examples of work that I think really do a great job of this. So the first example is this work on what I call the asymmetry line of work, which is Parker's group has done some work on this, but there's also sort of in the same vein, there's work that Katja Sakara's group have done, where you don't just think about a single robot and assign a robot to a particular task. You have to take that abstraction, which is think about a robot performing a task, and crack it open and look inside and look at the atomic or more basic capabilities that the robot has. So it's kind of like that picture of Reed's earlier work where you're going to think about a robot that has a manipulator and another robot that has maybe a sensing modality. And now you're not assigning robots to tasks, but you're thinking about matching resources together. And if you do that, of course, then you get new interesting matching problems. They tend to be hard to do, so they're NP hard or harder. There's some work on thinking about how you could reason about tasks that have interesting interrelationships. So there's this great taxonomy that not enough people know about called the comprehensive taxonomy for multi-robot task allocation. It's sort of a response to the Gerke-Matard taxonomy that people study. And this has a very rich idea of the way that tasks can interrelate and they can conflict and they can share resources and so on. So there's another view of thinking about the world that way. And then a student of mine had done some work on thinking about how, if you're going to combine robots together, you need to reason about their utility for performing a particular task. So I'm going to talk about an approach which is in no way related to any of those. That's, as I said, I'm going to try to talk about something which is as distinct as possible. So our inspiration, one of our inspirations comes from this work that was, I guess, done in nearly 10 years ago, or 10 years ago now, I guess, on this, I guess it was a DARPA-funded program called SDR. And this is an example of a robot from Andrew Howard's paper where he has sort of a mixture of robots. Sorry, I'll talk to the microphone. So some highly capable individuals that have laser rangefinders, the others that have fiducials and are much simpler. So that's our first inspiration. So think about a case here where we have a robot team, maybe they have to interact with a simpler robot swarm. Our second inspiration is to look at these ants called, well, this is a whole genus of ants called driver ants or safari ants. And you can see, first of all, those are two ants from the same colony. The soldiers are much, much larger, so you have this diversity in the same colony. Those are mandibles. And what's interesting about this ant, the driver ant, is that it forms columns as it moves through the environment. And it does that in a way which is not perfectly clear from this photo, but hopefully the next one to make it clearer, where the soldiers are building a wall on either side, and most of the workers move between them. So it's kind of like the soldiers assemble a freeway, and the other agents move through there. So here's another example. You can see from their different heights that they've got their mandibles up in the air. Here's another view. You can see them on the outside, like this. So there you can see they're kind of reaching up and they're constraining the other ants. So that's one of our inspirations. Think about, okay, we've got robots or ants with different capabilities. We want them to behave as a cooperative, cohesive whole. So now I'm going to show you the third inspiration, which is another heterogeneous system. In this case, there's one robot, so it's not a multi-robot system. There's one robot, and in this case, these are geese. So this is I think the fourth dissertation that I'm listing here, but if we look at, just watch this video. So that's the single robot. And we're going to switch to the overhead view right now. So there's a bunch of geese in there, so they've got their own cooperative, gregarious behavior. And this robot is moving around and is herding them to different places. So as you'll see in a second, the robot has a model of the group and is interacting with this group in a particular way. Right? So it has combining. We've got one model, one robot, which has a representation of the other robots or other agents and is interacting. So we've been exploring that idea. And we like to think about robots as complicated. They have all these axes, which, how complicated is the sensing, how much computation do we have? But there's an axis which is so often, we feel, overlooked. We decided to study it directly, which is to think about the environment. So it's great to see Vaughan's example there. Now, really, that's one of my favorite pieces of work ever. But it also works partly because you're in this cylindrical environment. The environment is adding some information, it's adding some structure. So I'm at Texas A&M, and this is an example of where we see herding behavior, where there's an environment and the environment is providing structure. Okay, but here's another example. So that's not a very high resolution example, but that's a fishing weir where what we have is structure where fish swim into this and they're removed from the ocean. So we're interested in these things, that's to say environmental structures that have some functionality. They release some latent functionality that a swarm of agents have. And in this case, we're interested in those agents being just implicitly controlled agents. So we have a very simple framework, which is not that important, but basically we're going to generate environments, we're going to validate them, we're going to test them in a simulation. We're going to make no assumptions about the rules of the agents themselves, the things that we're looking at, how they behave, and I'll talk about that in a second. And you might ask, how are we generating environments? We have several different ways, but one way we've thought about this is to parameterize the space of environments with a generative process based on shape parameters. This is just one of the examples that we've done. And so we're kind of agnostic to the rules that the flocks are using, so this is sort of an example of something which is maybe inspired from Reynolds-Boyd's. If you know of those particular rules, they're just very simple things. Look at your neighbors, don't crash into them, don't be too far away from them, try to align them. So here's some more examples of fish weirs. First one is made out of rock, the second one is sort of another man-made structure. You can see some fish captured in there. This is a close-up of what a fish weir looks like. Okay, now the next slide I'm going to show you is an environment that our system found automatically. Okay, so it was given the task of trying to capture these agents which have some gregarious social behavior, and it's not the most elegant environment in the world, but it found this in the space of environments. So somehow the combination of this environment and the rules that those agents have mean that there's this sort of emergent phenomenon that they will stick together and they will stay in that spot. So here's a second example. So once we had generated some of these environments and found these behaviors, of course we implemented them on robots. So here we built one in the lab, as sort of close as we could. Scaling, and you can see we're putting one robot in and also 3 robots on the right-hand side, and you'll see something quite interesting, we think. Which is actually the first robot kind of wanders in and then wanders back out, whereas the other 3 kind of have some interference of the boundary and they stay there. So that was kind of intriguing to us because it suggested that maybe the reason the fish are captured is they have this social behavior to keep them aligned, and that's actually a maladaptive behavior in the case when you're able to construct an environment that will exploit that. And indeed, actually, you can show that depending on the size of the flock, you get different behaviors from these weirs. Also, I said we're agnostic with respect to the rules, but these are different sorts of biological models. You can do something very interesting. You can say, for 2 biological models for the same species, can you find me an environment which will disambiguate the 2 models? For example, you can get a maximally ambiguous environment. So now we're talking about heterogeneity. The idea is that these are basically primitives. These are geometric primitives. We can actually use these geometric primitives to plan motions. So suppose I've got a flock of robots and they're at A and I want to get them to B. Well, starting with just the environment which is in black, using this framework we have, we can figure out how to lay these additional barricades which will guide the flock, and then of course we can put robots to realize the barricades. And in this case, when I don't have enough robots, what I can do is I can track the motion of the robot of the flock, and then I can reassign them. So I can have a means of sort of deliberative allocation of what the robots need to do in order to control the flock. And so here's a video of us actually doing that in the lab. It's not the best video in the world, but there's static walls on the left-hand side, but you'll see here these agents are going to move around to the other side. So I think I'm actually almost running out of time. I think I have 1 minute left. So this is interesting because it relates to all sorts of other work, like hopper design, where here we're not talking about physical interactions, we're talking about social interactions. It relates to a lot of work on shepherding, some of the work that Rebecca's been doing on some of the work Steve Lavell's group has done on weasel balls, all of these things. Actually goes back to some earlier work that I did on deployment of audio beacons to help people who are evacuating a building. The idea is that the flock that you're controlling are actually people who might be panicked, and you can put robots at different locations and you can turn their beacons on and off. And in some sense, like changing the emergency lighting conditions to get load balancing in the network. All right, so in my last 10 seconds, I'll say we had high hopes for heterogeneous systems. We have, as a field, not demonstrated a whole bunch of them. I think there's more work to be done. I think that they're going to cause us to think harder about what we're going to model, how we're going to decompose the system into sub-teams that could either be as one system controlling another system, as in the example I gave, or it could be thinking about the robots at the level of capabilities and planning on those. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to, I think that the call came at exactly the right time for us to start thinking about these questions. There are obviously real-world implications as we have interesting aircraft and different robots in the ocean. And I think that there's still some sort of fundamental questions about how to model these systems which we haven't addressed yet. So with that, I'll take any questions, I think.
Thank you.